Welcome to Windows on the World. And over the past few weeks, I've been doing a lot of research. And I think I said in the last live stream that also been traveling quite a lot. Went to the site of the Vinci culture in Serbia. And I've been putting together a lot of things, including an audio book and some ideas. So when I'm actually not broadcasting, I'm always doing something which is connected to the lifelong learning project because it's too late to stop now. So tonight we're going to be talking about some really interesting stuff, and it still carries on with this idea of infiltration and assimilation rather than conquest. And tonight we're going to be talking about the serpent cult, the Brotherhood of the Snake, and the cults which may and probably did come from it. So we're talking about the Indian Brahmins, the Egyptian cult of the pharaohs, the pharaonic cult, and the Pharisee cult, which is directly linked to the Egyptian cult. And that's what we're going to be looking into this evening. So the assumed priest class, an assumed priest class behind the curtains, which is directing the front puppets. This is what we had in ancient Egypt. The pharaohs were puppets, they were poster boys. The imposed religion and ritual which was peculiar to that part of the world was not like any other part of the world. And it was a strict control system and a death cult. You were preparing yourself for an easy life after death. It was completely materialistic, and it revolved around neurosis and the worship of many, many gods. So we're going to be talking actually about the Hyksos. Now, the Hyksos actually either invaded, took over, or slowly infiltrated the Egyptian cult. But nobody actually knows. And the interesting thing about this is that nobody knows who the Hyksos actually were. They guess where they came from, and the guesses are all around that particular area. Syria, they could have come from Ebla, which was a massive city in Syria, around 260,000 people. 260,000 people. I think Alexandria had around 500 to 600,000 people at this time. And the language of Eblate was a Semitic language, and we see the influence of Hebrew and Aramaic in this region, also what they called Phoenician Canaanite. So the Hyksos appeared in Egypt. This is what we're told. And they were known as the rulers of foreign lands, only by people who would name them the Hyksos. So the Hyksos never had a name for themselves. And if they had a name for themselves, we don't know what it is. They are called the Hyksos, which means the rulers of foreign lands. So by infiltration or conquest, they steered the Egyptian cult of the dead into further neurosis. They introduced, for instance, Baal worship and Moloch. They introduced the aspects of Baal and Moloch worship and the sacrificial bull. So this is really interesting because it ties in to the Brahmin cult with their sacrificial bull and Shiva's bull and this multitude of gods which were morphic. In other words, they weren't all human looking. So, you know, we've got Ganesh, we've got all these gods of Hinduism, but the same rituals exist in the Brahmin cult. So the question is, who were these people and where did they come from? Because nobody actually knows. So the Hyksos were assumed to be from the Levant, but they don't really know. And here's the dumb overview. I'm going to read this out. According to the AI internet, the Hyksos were a group of people of West Asian origin who established dominance over parts of Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, roughly from 664 to 1555 BC. They are known as Hyksos, which translates to rulers of foreign countries in Egyptian. While often depicted as invaders, archaeological evidence suggests a more nuanced interaction, with the Hyksos assimilating into Egyptian culture and even adopting aspects of Egyptian rule. Now, this is interesting. Let's look at the present time. Let's look at the infiltration mechanism that is happening at the moment, the technocratic communitarian infiltration mechanism, which is not spoken of anywhere, apart from on this show or maybe a few others. Now, infiltration and assimilation is much better than conquest. And it's much more insidious, and it can exert much more control over the population, because if they don't know they've been conquered, as in Western countries at the moment, some of them may have more clue than others, but it seems to me that Britain particularly is completely clueless as to the form of governance that they're under and the infiltration which has taken over all forms of global to local governance. So I know I'm bringing that in, but that is infiltration. And infiltration is something I've been talking about for 20 years, but nobody else sees it. They still go back to the two lies. The two lies, left and right. Well, it'd be all right when the Tories are out. Well, guess what? The global mafia won the UK election. Keir Starmer got in. So now people who voted for Labour are realising there's something wrong. But how many years does it take for this to sink in? Well, that's 50 years they've had. 50 years and 20 to 25 years of the current global to local communitarian infiltration. So infiltration is a much more effective way of governance than conquest. So let's get back to this. They don't know who the Hyksos were. They could have been from Ebla in Syria. They could have been Canaanites. They could have been Phoenicians. And remember that the Phoenicians have now been tracked genetically. The skeletons of the people from Phoenicia, which became Phoenicia in 1200 BC because the Canaanites disappeared overnight. So isn't it possible that this infiltration, which happened in Egypt with the Hyksos, happened in that same area of the Levant by people from outside? So who were they? We still don't know. So the Phoenicians were a seafaring people. They were very successful, and they say their base was in Carthage. But as we look at history, we find out that the base of something is just where they find most of the artifacts. They don't actually know. In fact, I think it was only in 1974 or thereabouts that Ebla was discovered properly. Ebla was the most advanced civilization. It was in Syria, modern day Syria, and a city of 260,000 people. It had Eblate. They went back about 6,000 years, about the same timeline as Sumeria. They really don't know, of course. And yeah, 1200 BC, the Phoenicians took over from the Canaanites, a little bit like the Hyksos, or these rulers from foreign lands, taking over in what was called ancient Egypt. So we see a similar thing with the Brahmins of India, because the Brahmins of India were responsible for what became Hinduism. Now, Hinduism is a massive subject, but Brahmins control, they are the priest class which is behind the laws which are imposed on the people. They are an assumed priest class. Again, are we talking about the Brotherhood of the Snake, the serpent cult, the movement that they all feared, it seems, was 2,000 years ago, and it was Christianity. So the Brotherhood of the Snake were directly opposite to this new movement called Christianity, which actually came from a different area than had been done before. In other words, there was no middleman. We had Jesus, and then we had the Holy Spirit, and the early Christians were feared amongst those people in 43 AD who set up Freemasonry to counteract what they called the invisible force, the force they feared, the mysterious force, which they could not overthrow. So it appears that these control systems are spiritually weak, but they take over by infiltration. It makes a lot more sense when we think of it like that. And we have covered the Druidic Celtic Christians, the way the Druids, it appears, accepted the Christianity, the way Christianity was the ancient religion of Britain, not 600 AD, as we're told by the Romans, with Augustine converting King Ethelbert in Kent, and then it's spreading from 597 AD. No, the first churches, the first Christian church in Britain that was known is believed to be in Glastonbury AD 30. And then if you look at the Albion's Apostles show, we go into all of this circumstantial evidence, to be fair, that Jesus and Joseph of Arimathea did go to the British Isles. Now, once I started looking into this and stripped away the academia, it appeared that academia doesn't know. And that is what's interesting about this. So what this all seems to be about is power and control through a priesthood which is self-imposed, which takes away what is known as divine providence. So I'm going to read you something before we start properly from the perfected mind field. Providence and right action. The views of the crowd are artificially imposed. Most people will say they have their own minds. Being captive is hard to admit to. They let an imposed system speak through them and for them. The worldview then is a constructed norm which is adapted to different genetics. This is the key point. So the infiltration through a priesthood is through genetic adaptation. In other words, you find the temperament of the people and you give them a system which they can adhere to, which won't be too much trouble for them, but will keep them away from their own divinity and worshipping maybe thousands of gods and doing daily rituals like the ancient Egyptians, which prepared them for death, where they could go into an afterlife through the view of materialistic gain. And that is exactly what the ancient Egyptian priesthood imposed on the Egyptians. So they were constantly preparing for death, getting everything right, making sure that everything was in place. And when they died, they'd have their organs weighed, they'd meet Thoth, and they'd be allowed into the underworld. Now, this is not advanced thinking. It's very limited thinking. And we see this control system in those who were said to have been in the captivity. Now, we can't confuse this with what are called Jews in the modern world, because the word Jew is a 15th century word, and these people were not necessarily Israelites. And this is where, again, the Britain Shattered Isles stuff comes in. Okay, I've got a bias to that. I'm not going to give you confirmation bias, though, because I'm not expecting anyone to believe it. But if you look at our Shattered Isles series, you'll find out what that's all about. But yes, the worldview is constructed norm. It's a constructed norm which is adapted to the genetics of the people, their inherent moods, their inherent temperament. Perception can be managed through imposed beliefs. Group identity will restrict knowledge. There is nothing more attuned than the highest intelligence, which is what they want to keep you away from. The imposed worldview is a set of principles, laws, in these cases, views and beliefs which dictate behavioral response. A word together with an image equals a concept, then becomes a reality in the minds of people. So you give them multiple gods as distraction from their own divinity, their own connection to the true God. And that is what this is all about. That's how you control people and keep them away from their power, which was the whole purpose of the original Freemasonry. If we go back to the force they fear, you can find that at windowsontheworld.net, 43 AD, Hiram Abiud, who later became known as Hiram Abiff for Freemasons. So the Freemasons are willing dupes for something which they don't understand. And it all goes back to this idea of, you could call it the brotherhood of the snake, because that is a good enough terminology to describe what this belief system comes from. And of course, they don't call themselves the brotherhood of the snake. So the same infiltration as of old, just a new system. Now, Jesus healed others. This is the point. So Christianity, when that was thrown into the mix, something changed. The actions were selfless. They came from higher power, and they were for a bigger purpose than short-term gain or to impose fear or wonderment, as in the fakirs of India. This is advanced thinking compared to what was going on at the time, because it meant that positive right action was true divinity. Whereas in the Brahmin caste system, the adherents to gurus and the fakirs, who would bury themselves alive or they would stay up for weeks on end, these were exhibitions, these were circus tricks to make the people think these people were superhuman and next to the Godhead. So there's a big difference between this belief system of the early Christians and Essenes to what had happened before. So it was a big sea change in belief. Of course, we had the Zoroastrians, we had a Zoroaster in Persia, which was slightly more advanced than these cults, than this Brahmin system, this caste system, this strict caste system, which was very similar to how the Pharaonic system operated in Egypt. Okay, you can say different language, different symbols, different gods, but they cross over the archetypes of the gods and what one does to create wealth are all the same concept. So the priest class create biorobots through fear, constant ritual, fixation on short-term greed and the limited self, putting a block between you and divine providence. A priesthood who know this and impose laws, ritual and fear to keep you away from providence. So yes, we've covered recently direct experience with the Creator. We've covered the druidic forms of worship, which were not temples. In fact, the true Israelites were told that they did not need to form these stone temples, these architectural masterpieces to worship in. Avebury, place of worship, open within a circle. So a circle has no sides and a circle sees in every direction. And a circle is directly in tune with nature all around. So this is more advanced than the ritualistic neurosis imposed by the Hyksos, by the Brahmins on these cults. So that is something I think very much worth considering. And okay, we're going to now have a quote from Wallace Budge. And we did a show called Pharaoh's Elite Crowd Control. Now, this show, Pharaoh's Elite Crowd Control, we used some quotes from the Egyptologist in the early 1900s, Wallace Budge, who was a real authority on ancient Egypt as far as anyone could be, because he was actually there with the people who excavated in Egypt, and he found the same fears and rituals still in place in modern day Egypt, even in the early 1900s. The same superstitions that the pharaohs had put around their tombs to frighten people were still intact all that time later. Let's have a quote here. The Egyptians, however, acted in a perfectly logical manner, for they believed that they were a divine nation. Have we heard this before? A little bit later. And that they were ruled by kings who were themselves gods incarnate. Their earliest kings, they asserted, were actually gods who did not disdain to live upon earth and to go about and up and down through it and to mingle with men. So their gods were equal to men. Other ancient nations were content to believe that they had been brought into being by the power of their gods operating upon matter. But the Egyptians believed that they were the issue of the great God who created the universe and that they were of directly divine origin. Where have we heard this before? The way things are playing out at the moment, it may be the end of this belief system because of the created fake state of Israel in the Middle East, fully exposing itself to the world. This is the same thing. A belief that's imposed on a people where they are told that they are of the gods. Egyptians believed that they were the issue of the great God who created the universe and that they were of directly divine origin. When the gods ceased to reign in their proper persons upon earth, it carries on. I won't go into that. I'll go into the next bit. In comparatively late historical times, the Egyptians introduced into their company of gods a few deities from Western Asia, but these had no effect in modifying the general character either of their religion or of their worship. In other words, they were in a systematic, tight ritual area. They couldn't get out of it. They were mentally and physically trapped in a material container. And the only way through that was through their priesthood. And they were told that they were unique. There was nobody else like them in the world, which made them incredibly insular. And that is what Budge brings up again and again, the insularity of the Egyptians, because he said there was nowhere else that had this strict control system. So in other words, they had been ring-fenced by a self-appointed priestcraft who had genetically organized them into a cult which suited their previous belief system, but kept them fully under control. And that control included the biorobotization through ritual and circumcision on the 8th day. This was introduced, and the Pharisaic cult later introduced it also, because that later, of course, became the rabbinical cult, the Midrash, and the Talmud. So the subject of comparative Egyptian and Semitic mythology is one which has yet to be worked thoroughly. Not because it would supply us with the original forms of Egyptian myths and legends, but because it would show what modifications such things underwent. Okay, so what we've got here is a people who are totally isolated from every other culture within a ritual system which ultimately controls them until the point of death and after death. After death, they were told that they had to meet the gods of the underworld, Anubis, be judged by Thoth, have their organs weighed. The Isis, Osiris, and Horus cult was believed to have been brought in by the Hyksos and also along with Baal and Moloch. So we can start to see a bigger picture here of how we could be looking at a priestcraft which spread out quite a long way and right through the Middle East. So it says in the book by Michael Hoffman, has some great quotes in it about Judaism. And this is called Judaism's Strange Gods, because the same template that we're talking about in ancient Egypt in a different way went into this cult. So, according to Josephus, there was no such nation known where the Israelites came from. Nobody knows who the Israelites were. I contend that they were in the British Isles. Wacky, I know, but I've done a lot of research into it. It's all circumstantial, but it makes sense to me. Not trying to convince anyone of anything there. But we have to remember that Israel wasn't a physical place. It was a place of refuge. It was a place that was not necessarily and pretty much certainly not in the current state of Israel, because nothing's ever been found there to indicate that it was there. People have come up with other circumstantial stuff, but it makes sense that it wasn't there. To preface this, that there was no such nation as the Israelite nation is a truth found in the consideration that they were not mentioned beyond the Bible in any physical records of countries. Egypt knew them not, Persia knew them not, Hindustan knew them not, Scythia knew them not, Phoenicia knew them not, Greece knew them not as a nation. And in the first general notice that we have of the Jews, or the 15th century word Jew, they are introduced to the world as a sect or a series of sects. Remember, the word Jew is a 15th century word. The people then who controlled this group were called the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, who later became aligned with Christianity through James the Just. And the Essenes obviously are connected to the Nag Hammadi texts, which were found in Qumran in 1945, I think. And then, of course, we've got the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are very dubious indeed, if you read about them. It says, Phoenicia knew them not. Greece knew them not as a nation. And then the first general notice that we have, yes, they are introduced to the world as a sect, being Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. And in that general notice, beyond that sort of mistaken allegorical history, which Josephus spouts, there is nothing. So doesn't it make sense that there was a controlling force behind these cults? And that controlling force had adapted itself over a long period of time. Yes. So who were the captivity? This is an interesting one, isn't it? And what did they have done to them? Biorobots through ritual and fear. Remember, the Hyksos infiltrated as rulers of foreign lands. So they were already rulers of foreign lands when they took control of the pharaonic cult in Egypt. So that is all we know about the Hyksos. I've told you everything that is known about them so far. Now I'm going to give you a quote. The serpent in 2 Corinthians 11:13 is an ophis. He is the serpent race, the same who beguiled Eve. This is from the book The Serpent Race by B.F. Jackson. St. Paul is worried about the Christians being influenced by the new Gnostic version of the Luciferian doctrine revised by Simon Magus, the infiltration again, the Simon of Acts 8:9-13 in Acts, to sabotage the faith in God. That's just a side issue which I thought you might find interesting. Brahmanism, the Egyptian pharaonic system, control systems, are a pyramid of power. Now, we're not going to get into the building of the pyramids because the people of Egypt and the pharaohs, the front puppets, probably had nothing to do with that at all. And if we go to the Valley of the Kings and we look at the later pyramids, the whole of the civilization had been corrupted. So there's a lot of questions. And also, even the dynasties, the order of the dynasties is not really known. It's assumed, but not known. And there's a lot of stuff that's been found that questions everything about it. Once you start looking into dynastic Egypt, and then you find out that the way it was compiled is not necessarily even in the right order. And this is the problem with all academia. Academics will accept and support theories. Well, the idea of trying to find out what's behind a governing system is to forget about theories and look at the results and how people were controlled and for what purpose. Then things start to make more sense. So again, it's the pyramid system. The self-elected elite in the top part of the pyramid, which is a removed capstone. In the middle, we've got the administrators, the priest class, the initiates, who have knowledge according to their position. And at the bottom of the pyramid, the serfs with no knowledge. It's the same pyramid of power which has been used for many thousands of years. It's not really changed. So according to imposed historical view, the 6,000-year-old civilizations, we have the pharaohs, and I'll show elite crowd control. The control was overt through a priest class. The pharaohs were front puppets. There was constant ritual which filled up nearly all of their time. Can you imagine that? Now let's go to the Pharisee cult and the Midrash, which was the precursor to the first so-called Jewish book, the Talmud, which is the neurosis and arguments of rabbis. And this again is completely and utterly overtaken by ritual, which is of course why Jesus had a problem with the Pharisees in the first place. He said they worshipped dead men's bones, that they were really just obsessed with things which did not matter, because in trying to control the priest class, trying to control people like that, they turn them into bio robots and neurotics, which is exactly what happened in Egypt, exactly what happened in the Pharisaic cult. So they had nature gods, celestial gods of the planets, earth, air, fire, and water. And in ancient Egypt, Apep was hostile to man, representing the serpent. And the Babylonian system was nothing like as strict as the system in ancient Egypt. Of course, we had the Babylonian demons and gods. But what we find is that this area of ancient Egypt was peculiar to the whole of that region. So it was controlled in a way that other areas weren't. So yes, the Egyptians spent much of their time in ritual worship and preparing for death. It was a materialistic culture, 100% materialistic. The perfect afterlife was a life of ease and leisure, where they would have enough cattle, where they would have land, where they would have wine, where they would have bread, where they would have meat. This was their nirvana. In other words, there was no expectation of a higher sense of knowledge or going through stages of higher knowledge. There was simply ritual, death, and an allowed resurrection in an afterlife, which continued in the same way as the material life had also continued. Look at the gold masks, the mummification, the stupid amount of furniture in the tombs when they're excavated. So it was a life which was preparing consistently for death, a controlled and fear-based existence controlled by a priest class, a cult that worshipped chimeras, part animal, part human, and of course the dead. They were convinced they were a divine nation, a special people. Their gods were incarnate. Other nations operated under God. Egyptians believed they were of divine origin above other races. The priesthood were sleight of hand magicians, as in the Indian fake gurus of today like Sai Baba. And of course, the cups and balls trick originated in ancient Egypt. I used to do this. I used to sell magic tricks years ago in a market. I found it fascinating because the cups and balls trick looks like the balls are going through the cup and then they disappear and then they reappear again. It's really simple. But if you did that to people in a crowd and you did it as a magician with a big show, they would believe that you were a magician. So this is where the conjuring tricks of the temples originated. So yes, I'm going to get into some of the stuff now. The Isis, Osiris and Horus dynasty was spread by the Hyksos even after the 14th dynasty in Egypt. Traders who gained influence is the question mark of who the Hyksos were. Well, it looks like they were the priesthood that controlled them. Baal was introduced into the Egypt cult, as well as Moloch. So these were Canaanite gods. So where did the Canaanites go? They simply disappeared when the Phoenicians took over in 1200 BC. Look it up. That's what they say. They don't know where the Canaanites went. They don't know where that cult went. They know very little about that cult. So the Hyksos god was actually Set. Baal and Moloch and Set were introduced. On 1539 BC, it is stated the Hyksos were completely expelled from Egypt. So if we start looking into this, we have the Egyptian captivity. So claimed to be modern day captives from 1500 known as Jews. Who were they? Experimentation on these people by the Brotherhood of the Snake and the rules, the triggerable biorobots of these cults. This starts to come together into something which is making a lot more sense. Now, this is going to be one of a continuing number of shows on this because I've got so many notes here. I don't want to give you too much tonight, but it does look like the Brahmins and the ancient Egyptian cult of the pharaohs were biologically tailored to the temperament of the people they were imposed on. So let's have a look at the Brahmins, because this is very interesting. I was in Nepal and India for about a year, on and off, got to know Hinduism pretty well. And it's a massive subject, but originally it was imposed by the Brahmins. Who were they? The self-appointed priesthood, who distributed the Vedas, which were actually the books of law. Same as the Pharisees distributed the Talmud, the Midrash, the Gemara, the religion of law. So, self-appointed with a caste system. The caste system really appealed to the West because it did them a lot of good, because they could get in with the Brahmins and the Brahmins had everyone under control. So empire was easy. So the continuation of the serpent race, yes. We have the Vedas distributed by the Brahmin priesthood as being from God himself. Where have we heard this before? So the phallic Shiva lingam was incorporated. That's this. The Shiva lingam is the phallus of Shiva, which you find everywhere in India and Nepal. It's a black object, looks like a capstan. It's meant to be a penis, and they group together in 6, 12, 8s, and there's loads of them all together. If you go to the temples in Nepal, I've been to all these places. The temple in Kathmandu, what they call the monkey temple, I can't remember the actual name of it now, there's so many there. But if you go up there, of course, the monkey's sacred. And you go up there and there's all these Shiva lingams. There's Shiva lingams everywhere and people touch them. It's part of this ritual. But the Shiva lingam, it looks like, was brought into India through the Brahmins because there had been a fertility cult previously. So the Shiva lingam introduced Shiva. It introduced Vishnu and Brahma, God himself, and introduced around 1500 BC. It was a law system through what's known as the Rig Veda. And yes, the Vedas were distributed by the priesthood. And yes, they had temple priests, very much similar control system as the Pharisees, very much similar control system as in Egypt. Similar in its managerial aspect. So Shiva was the embodiment of Moloch, Typhon, and Saturn. And Shiva became a much more playful character in recent Hinduism, but he is ruled and rules by fire. The sacrificial bull was also introduced. Where have we seen that before? Of course, the Canaanites, the altar of Moloch at Beersheba, the burning of people in the sacrificial bull. Well, the Brahmins did the same thing for the non-believers thousands of years ago. They were into fire worship. The eternity of matter was updated, as in the later Egyptian dynasties. Transmutation through destruction came through the cycle of life and death through Shiva. And Kali had to be worshipped and appeased, as did the gods of ancient Egypt. Remember, it started off about 530 gods in ancient Egypt and went up to 1200 under the Hyksos. These people had them running around like idiots all day long. So, Kali, again, was this destructive goddess. And I've been to Kali temples. In Kali temples, you get mass slaughter of animals, still carries on to this day. Gadamai, the slaughter of up to 10,000 buffalo. It can't be made illegal because there's too many people who believe in it. They try and stop this mass slaughter, but these sacrificial cults and these adherences to ritual, when we have the Holy Spirit, when we have divine providence, are a complete distraction. And they are also open gateways to demonism. So we now have the entitled Westerner believing in the goddess cult of Kali, having pictures of Kali in the house, saying Kali is the mother goddess. A Hindu would never have a picture of Kali in their house. Kali has to be appeased, it's respected, it's feared. Again, it's a deity which is imposed on people through their own minds. Yet it is a gateway for the demonic forces talked about by the earlier scenes, the people who wrote the Nag Hammadi scriptures. They talked of the demiurge, the archons, these invisible rulers who were omnipresent and amongst them. So interlopers between man and God. This is what we're talking about here. Yes, the Vedas, the word of God, Vishnu, preserved the merchant class, the middle classes. So they worshipped Vishnu and he collected taxes. They collected taxes on behalf of Vishnu. Shiva needed ritual obedience. I've been to Shivaratri several times. They set fires in the street. They smoke marijuana. It's fun. People enjoy it, but it's a ritual. It's a ritual. And later, Shiva became, because Shiva wasn't originally the creator and destroyer and the generative power that came in. It appears with the Shiva Lingam through the Brahmins. Who were these people? Again, we go back to the Brotherhood of the Snake. We go back to the serpent race. So the fakirs, with their circus tricks, burying themselves alive, hanging upside down for days on end, not eating for months at a time, they could become Brahmins. So they were intermediaries. They could become part of the priest class when they learned extreme mind control. So connections to later Kabbalah in self-projection to higher realms is something that we find in the work of Wallace Budge and other authors. So this cult of self-worship, which later came around through the Pharisaic cult, and that we see today destroying itself through egotism and blindness, is connected, it seems, to these previous control systems. Because if these people were really under the control of the pharaohs and their pharaonic system, and the pharaonic system or the priesthood behind it introduced the circumcision and the biorobotization, the blacking out of the baby after 8 days so it can be mind controlled and triggered for life. So these people knew not only a lot about psychology, but they knew a lot about biological response and how the biological response triggers the brain. This is very clever stuff. It's quite demonic, you could say. Some would call it satanic because it's about overt control in taking you away from the creator. That's what all these cults were about, it appears. So yes, they had the Upnekat, I think it's called, the Book of Magic, which was all very similar to what happened in Egypt. In other words, you could imbibe artificial stimulants to take you into journeys into what they call the underworld, or to commune with these demons, because that's really what appears to have happened. It appears that this priest class got people worshipping demons, and that's been going on for so long. So yes, so the Pharisaic religion was a religion of law, the same as the Vedic religion, which hid behind later works such as the Bhagavad Gita, which are very philosophical, but they're all about making choices. They're all about law. They're basically the Brahmins and the Pharisees and the Hyksos were all about imposing ritual through law. Yes, we have the oral tradition, which is the Pharisaic cult, which took over from the Sadducees. And we had Judaism beginning, the history of Judaism begins with the Babylonian Talmud. Let's have a quote now to see what this Pharisaic cult thinks of itself. Rabbi Neusner. Rabbinic Judaism rose in Babylon during the centuries after Christ was crucified. So the Pharisaic cult was after Christ. It wasn't of the Old Testament, which is kind of interesting because in the mumblings of the scribes, the Pharisees, the rabbis in the Talmud, we get conversations which can actually usurp God, which can put mankind on a level with God. Again, we can go back to Kabbalah, which fantasists say originated 200 AD, but the real history of it is 1200 AD. But it came from some previous belief systems like the Zohar. The Zohar is the main book of the Kabbalah. So the center of this Pharisaic law system was the Mishnah. And it was a rabbinic system later on. From 300 AD, we had the oral Torah, the Halacha, which was the law. Again, it wasn't scripture, but it was later said to be given by God to Moses. And the idea was that after 70 AD, the fall of the Second Temple, that's when the cult of what was called modern day Judaism started. So let's have a few quotes now from the Zohar. So this is another control system. So the Mishnah was the burial place of Moses. So they reinvent the history of the Old Testament. And to understand the Bible, one must go to a rabbi. Rabbinism began as a group of self-appointed priests again. So the first book of this law system was the Talmud, which came from the Mishnah. And then we had the Talmud Shabbat, the Baba Metzvah, and we can have some quotes from that. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, a hero of this cult. He who occupies himself with scripture gains merit. That is not merit. So scripture, there is no merit in scripture. He who accepts or occupies himself with Mishnah, the law, from the priesthood, gains merit for which people will receive a reward. He who occupies himself with Talmud, there is no source of merit greater than this. So again, an imposed system of ritual and law. And the Talmud is full of ritual. So the Old Testament was denigrated in the Talmud unless it was viewed through the Talmud. So The Egyptian priesthood controlled and were part of the Pharisee cult, or the serpent cult. The mystery schools, well, there are no mysteries. There is only elite crowd control. How do you control people? You get to know their ethnicity, you get to know their temperament, and you get to know what their previous beliefs were, and you give them something which goes along with that, which controls them from life until after death. Because this was the idea, to control the soul after death, which of course we get in the Constantine Roman cult of modern day universal church Catholicism. It was all about controlling people after death. The sea of lost souls under control. So all this is about is taking away your divinity. So were the Hyksos the same people, the same priesthood as those that called themselves the Brahmins, the Pharisee Judaic cult? The Judaic cult came much later, of course. And the Essenes were this different branch who got wiped out by the Pharisees, of course. So we can see a pattern here. And that's what really this show is all about. And it all comes down to your connection with the Creator through divine providence. And in our show, The Force They Fear, what we talked about was how this priesthood, this imposed cult, were terrified of this new system, this new religion which became known as Christianity, which had a power which could not be controlled. So it appears that the whole purpose of the modern day cults from around, say, 200 BC onwards to the Roman cult of today is to keep people away from the direct connection with the Creator, which can be done through divine providence, which I find really fascinating. It's like a golden thread that you can join to a higher power, and you can do the work of that higher power. And it seems that the whole purpose of these cults is to stop that, because they are all about material reality. So you should be in the world, but not of it. Unlike, of course, the ancient Egyptians, who wanted to be in this world when they died, in the same world. And that is the key. So when we look around, we can see that this priestcraft, especially the Hyksos, could have come from anywhere in that region or anywhere not of that region. So when we talk about the rulers of a foreign land, who are we talking about? We know that there is a possibility, of course, that the Syrian system of Eblate and the city of Ebla could have had a lot of influence on Alexandria. But when it comes down to it, they don't really know at all. And Eblate came in about 3000 BC, which coincides again. 1600 BC, the Hittite king Mursili destroyed Ebla, so they say, also claimed by Sargon and Naram-Sin of Acadia, of Akkad. So the Akkadians also said that they destroyed Ebla, but there's no real evidence of that. So what it looks like is that the idea of infiltration in Canaan, Phoenicia, into Alexandria, and the Brahmin caste and the Pharisees, they are all interlinked by the same concept. Now, this might be really mind-blowing, and I think it is, even to me, but that's one of the things I've been looking at over the past several weeks, and I hope to do more on it. So I have got quite a lot more on this, but I think I've been going for quite a long time, and I want to finish off with a quote. It's the end of our show, Ritual and Religion, which can be found actually in the playlist, The Perfected Minefield. Religio. The word religio is not in the Roman Catholic Encyclopedia anymore, but it existed 2000 years ago, and it was the direct divine experience, not necessarily a big blissful experience. It could be a massive wake-up call, but it was a direct experience which meant communion with God or a connection to the Creator. Religio meant this direct experience, and religio, the word religio, has been taken out of the Catholic Encyclopedia, which is interesting. Religio in its most refined meaning is communion with God, but there are obstacles on this journey, and the only way to refine a connection to the unified field or the divine is to work on a full-time connection. That is the only accomplishment that is of any importance. Everything else is a distraction or illusion, as all true reality is revealed in divine inspiration through direct contemplation. We have heard the mantra, everything is just an illusion. In this case, it is true. That's a section from the show, an article I did called Ritual and Religion, which is trying to put together what this is really about. And it is so far away from the New Age cult and these cults of the wilderness or lostness of the mind that it has been pretty much disappeared off the face of the earth, because most people now have been taught to be entirely self-centered, self-referencing, the opposite of what the early Christianity was trying to do. In other words, you see the bigger picture, you react accordingly in real time with what is known as divinity. Then, of course, everything seems to work. And then you don't need ritual or these imposed belief systems. And it seems to be that simple. So hope you enjoyed that. But I'm just going to have a look at the comments. I was getting a bit distracted then. I say I'm going to sign off now. But in summary, the shows will continue regularly from now on. There were several weeks where I wasn't doing the shows because 1, I was traveling, 2, I'm working on the audio book, and 3, I was thinking about the next stage of where this is going to go. So this is a lifelong learning project that won't stop. Do please support the show. It's the most marginalized one out there. And you can do that by going to the homepage at windowsontheworld.net, or you can email me at info@windowsontheworld.net, and you can join the £5 a month club, or you can just do that on the homepage. But most importantly is the information which I get from people who send me in books, related information and ideas which are contributing to, I think, a very clear and well-defined bigger picture, which is one of the most important things in this wilderness of the mind, lostness of the mind period, which is what it's actually known as, where people are dumbing down more and more by the day and becoming more and more robotized. So the idea is to go against that. That's the purpose of this, and that's the purpose of these shows, these types of shows. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I will get off and have a look at the comments. So that's it for this show, and I'll be back probably about a week from now, because the shows are going to continue regularly.